James Wilson sat on the cold sidewalk of Main Street as people walked by without looking at him. At 43 years old, his face showed more age than it should. His beard was gray and uneven, and his eyes held the tired look of someone who had seen too much. 3 years had passed since he first started sleeping on these streets. Before that, he had been a soldier, serving his country in Afghanistan for 2 tours. Every morning, James woke up under the same bridge, his few belongings packed in a worn backpack. His routine never changed. He would fold his thin blanket, brush his teeth with water from a public fountain, and head to his usual spot downtown. There, he would sit with his cardboard sign that read "Veteran, Hungry, God Bless." Most days were the same. People walked by quickly, their eyes looking straight ahead or down at their phones. Some days, he might get a few dollars or some leftover food. Other days, nothing at all. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was feeling invisible. They look right through me, James often thought to himself, like I'm already a ghost. Before becoming homeless, James had a different life. He had been a mechanic after leaving the army. He had an apartment, a girlfriend, and plans for the future. But the nightmares from the war never stopped. He would wake up screaming, seeing his friends who died overseas. The loud noises at his job would make him drop to the ground, thinking he was back in combat. Soon, he started drinking to help him sleep. Then he lost his job. His girlfriend left. The bills piled up. One day, the landlord changed the locks on his apartment door. Just like that, James joined the many other veterans living on the streets. "Never thought I'd end up here," he would tell the few people who bothered to talk to him. "Fought for my country, and now I can't even fight for myself." Winter was the hardest time. The cold seemed to get into his bones, and the shelters were often full. This winter had been especially tough, with more rain than usual. Today was one of those wet, miserable days. The rain had been falling since morning, and James's jacket was soaked through. His sign was falling apart from the water, the letters blurring into unreadable marks. Most people walked even faster on rainy days, hurrying under umbrellas without slowing down. James huddled against a shop wall, trying to find some shelter from the downpour. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday when a kind worker from the coffee shop had given him a sandwich that was about to be thrown away. James watched as businessmen and women rushed by, talking on phones, carrying coffee cups, living lives so different from his own that they might as well be from another world. Sometimes he wondered if they knew how close they might be to his situation. How many paychecks, bad decisions, or unlucky breaks stood between their lives and his. As the afternoon wore on, the rain got harder. James's hands were red and stiff with cold. He thought about moving to the library to warm up, but the security guard there had kicked him out last time for sleeping in a chair, so he stayed, wet and hungry, holding his soggy sign, hoping someone might see him, really see him, before the day was done. The rain fell harder as afternoon turned to evening. James tried to count the coins in his cup, just enough for a cheap burger, if he was lucky. His stomach rumbled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day. The wet coldness had settled deep in his bones, making his old war injury ache. People rushed by faster now, eager to get home for dinner. James watched them with tired eyes. Sometimes he tried to guess their stories, where they lived, what their homes looked like, what they would eat tonight. It helped pass the time and keep his mind off his own hunger. As the streetlights came on, the crowd thinned out. James decided to wait a little longer before heading to the fast food place down the street. Just then, he noticed a young woman walking toward him. Unlike others, she wasn't rushing. She walked slowly, looking right at him. She was maybe 30 years old, with short black hair and glasses. She carried a bright yellow umbrella and wore a blue coat. What caught James's attention was that she was smiling, not the nervous smile people sometimes gave before hurrying past, but a real, warm smile. "Hi there," she said, stopping in front of him. "You're getting soaked. Mind if I share my umbrella for a minute?" James was so surprised that someone was talking to him that he just nodded. The woman crouched down next to him, holding the umbrella over both of them. "I'm Sarah," she said. "What's your name?" "James," he answered, his voice rough from not speaking much. "James Wilson." "Nice to meet you, James Wilson," Sarah said. She glanced at his sign. "You served?" "Yes, ma'am. 2 tours in Afghanistan." Sarah didn't ask him the usual questions, why he was homeless, or why he didn't just get a job. Instead, she asked, Which unit? James looked at her with surprise. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. You know someone who served? My brother, Sarah said. He was in Iraq. Came back different. Something in her voice told James that there was more to that story, but he didn't push. For the next 20 minutes, they just talked. Real talking, not someone tossing questions at him like he was a problem to solve. Sarah asked about his time before the war, about places he visited, about what kind of food he liked. Simple things that made James feel human again. As they talked, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. Street vendors were packing up their carts. Shop owners pulled down their metal gates for the night. James noticed a man in a business suit watching them from across the street, probably wondering why someone like Sarah was sitting with someone like him. I should let you go, James said. It's getting late. Sarah nodded but didn't get up right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out something. It was a worn leather messenger bag, the kind students used to carry books. I want you to have this, she said, holding it out to him. James shook his head. I can't take that. You've been kind enough already. Please, Sarah insisted. This bag, it has a story. It helped me once, when I needed it. Maybe it can help you too. There was something in her eyes that stopped James from refusing again. He slowly took the bag, surprised by its weight. There was something inside. Don't open it yet, Sarah said, standing up. Wait until you're somewhere dry and alone. Before James could thank her properly, Sarah pressed a folded $20 bill into his hand. Get something hot to eat tonight, okay? And James, check what's in the bag. Promise me? I promise, he said, still confused by her kindness. Sarah smiled one last time, then turned and walked away, her yellow umbrella bobbing through the evening crowd until she disappeared around a corner. James sat there holding the leather bag, wondering what was inside and why a complete stranger would care about a homeless veteran no one else even looked at. James waited until the rain stopped completely before getting up from his spot. His legs were stiff, and his back hurt from sitting all day. The messenger bag that Sarah had given him hung across his chest. It felt strange to have something new, well, new to him at least. The leather was soft in places where it had been worn down by its previous owner. With the $20 Sarah had given him, James walked to a small diner at the end of the block. He usually avoided places like this. The waitresses would give him looks, and sometimes the manager would ask him to leave. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was Sarah's kindness, or maybe it was having the clean-looking bag instead of his old dirty backpack. Whatever the reason, he pushed open the door. The bell above the door rang, and a few people looked up. James kept his head down and found a table in the corner. A waitress came over, her face tired from a long shift. Coffee and the daily special, please, James said, before she could tell him to leave. To his surprise, she just nodded and wrote down his order. 15 minutes later, James was eating the first hot meal he'd had in weeks. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and gravy. He ate slowly, making it last, watching people come and go. After dinner, James needed to find a safe place to sleep and to look inside the bag. He decided to go to his usual spot under the highway overpass. It wasn't much, but other homeless people respected that it was his space, and the concrete walls blocked the wind. When he reached his spot, he found his few belongings untouched: a rolled-up sleeping bag, a plastic tarp, and a backpack with extra clothes. James sat down on the sleeping bag and took a deep breath. Finally, he was alone and could see what was inside the mysterious bag. He opened the flap carefully. The first thing he saw was a sealed white envelope. His name was written on the front in neat handwriting. Inside the envelope, James found 5 crisp $40 bills, $200 in total. His hands shook as he held the money. It was more cash than he had seen in months. But that wasn't all. There was a folded piece of paper, a handwritten note. James moved closer to the light coming from a distant street lamp so he could read it. Dear James, the note began. You might be wondering why I gave you this bag. 3 years ago, I was where you are now. Not a veteran, but homeless, hopeless, and invisible. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. Now, I want to do the same for you. The money is to help you get through the next few weeks. The phone in the bag is prepaid for 6 months. My number is saved in it. The key is to a small studio apartment at the address on the tag. The rent is paid for 1 month. It's not much, but it's clean and safe. I'm not asking for anything in return except this. Try Just try. We all need a second chance sometimes. Call me if you need someone to talk to. You're not alone anymore. Sarah. James read the note 3 times to make sure he understood. He reached back into the bag and found a small phone, already charged, and a key with a paper tag. The address was on Maple Street, about 20 blocks from where he was now. His heart was racing. Was this some kind of joke or a trap? Why would a stranger do something so big for someone like him? James looked at the key in his palm, a real place to stay, a roof, a door that locked. It seemed impossible. He started to put everything back in the bag, planning to think about it overnight. As he did, his fingers touched something else at the bottom of the bag. It was a small plastic card. James pulled it out and saw it was a veteran's ID card. Not his, but someone else's. The name on it was Michael Chin. Sarah's brother, James realized. The one who went to Iraq and came back different. The pieces started coming together in James's mind as he stared at the photo of the young soldier on the ID card. What had happened to Michael? And why had Sarah really chosen to help him? James spent a restless night under the highway. The messenger bag never left his side, tucked inside his sleeping bag with him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the key to the apartment and the veteran's ID card with Michael's face. Questions kept him awake. Was Sarah trying to replace her brother with him? Was this all too good to be true? When morning came, James still hadn't decided what to do. He packed his few belongings, stuffing them into his old backpack, the new messenger bag he wore across his chest. It felt like it carried not just items, but a responsibility he wasn't sure he could handle. What would you do? James asked an old man named Pete, who sometimes shared the space under the highway. Me? Pete laughed, showing his missing teeth. I'd run to that apartment before she changes her mind. But that's just me. I know you got your pride. Pride. James almost laughed. What pride did he have left? He'd been eating from trash cans and sleeping in the dirt for 3 years. He'd been spit on, kicked out of stores, and treated worse than stray dogs. Still, something held him back from using the key. What if it's not real? James said out loud, though Pete had already wandered off. What if I get there and the key doesn't work? Or worse, what if it does work and I mess it all up? For 3 days, James carried the bag everywhere, but didn't use the key. He used a little of Sarah's money to buy food and a new pair of socks, but he saved most of it. The phone stayed off. He wasn't ready to talk to her yet. Each night, he returned to his spot under the highway. On the 4th day, the weather turned bad. Dark clouds rolled in early, bringing harsh winds that cut through James's thin jacket. By noon, rain poured down harder than it had all week. The highway overpass offered some protection, but water still ran in streams through James's sleeping area. As he huddled there, soaking wet and shivering, hail began to fall. Small pieces at first, then larger ones that bounced painfully off his shoulders and head when he tried to move to a drier spot. This is crazy, James muttered, pulling the messenger bag tight against his chest. I'm going to die out here from being too scared to try. Something inside him finally broke. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of hope. It all seemed smaller than his fear of spending another night in this storm. James grabbed his backpack and stood up, the decision made. The walk to Maple Street took over an hour in the storm. Twice, James almost turned back. By the time he found the address on the key tag, he was soaked to the bone and shaking with cold. It was a simple 4-story building, not fancy, but not run down either. Just a normal apartment building where normal people lived. James stood outside for a long time, staring up at the windows, wondering which one might be his, if the key was real. The building had a security door at the entrance. James looked at the tag again, apartment 2B. Taking a deep breath, he tried the key in the main door. It turned smoothly, and the door opened. His heart beat faster. Inside was a small lobby with mailboxes and a stairwell. James climbed to the 2nd floor, leaving puddles on each step. The hallway was clean and quiet. He found 2B at the end of the hall. James stood in front of the door, key in his trembling hand. What would he find inside? Was this all just a cruel joke? He thought about turning around, going back to his safe, familiar spot under the highway. All I ask is that you try, Sarah had written. With his heart pounding, James put the key in the lock. For a terrible moment, it seemed stuck. Then, slowly, it turned. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open, half expecting to find an empty room, or worse, strangers wondering why this wet, homeless man was breaking into their apartment. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a small, clean studio apartment. Real furniture, a real bed, a kitchen, empty but waiting. For him. James stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For the first time in 3 years, he turned a lock from the inside, keeping the world out instead of the world keeping him out. James stood in the doorway of apartment 2B for a long time, afraid to move. The place wasn't big, just one main room with a small kitchen area, a door that probably led to a bathroom and a closet, but to someone who had slept under bridges for 3 years, it looked like a palace. The walls were painted a soft blue color. There was a bed with clean sheets and a gray blanket in one corner. Near the window sat a small table with 2 chairs. A mini fridge hummed quietly in the kitchen area. The floor was clean, and the whole place smelled faintly of pine cleaner. James slowly took off his wet shoes and left them by the door. His socks were soaked too, so he removed those as well. The feeling of a clean, dry floor under his bare feet almost made him cry. "Is this real?" he whispered to the empty room. He walked to the bathroom and flipped on the light. A clean toilet, sink, and shower stared back at him. Hanging on a hook was a new towel. On the sink counter sat a toothbrush, still in its package, toothpaste, soap, and shampoo. James caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. His beard was long and tangled. His hair stuck out in all directions. His face was weathered, with deep lines around his eyes. How long had it been since he'd really looked at himself? "You look like hell, Wilson," he told his reflection. The hot water in the shower felt like a miracle. James stood under the spray until his skin turned pink, watching as months of dirt swirled down the drain. He used the shampoo twice, then scrubbed his body with the soap until he felt human again. Clean and wrapped in the towel, James returned to the main room. He opened the closet and found clothes hanging inside: jeans, t-shirts, a couple of button-up shirts, even a jacket. All simple, but new and in what looked like his size. On the floor of the closet were 2 pairs of shoes and several pairs of new socks still in their packaging. Who does this? James wondered aloud. Sarah's kindness went beyond anything he could understand. After dressing in clean clothes, James continued exploring the apartment. The mini fridge held some basic food: milk, eggs, bread, cheese, apples, and bottled water. In the cabinet above it, he found cereal, canned soup, peanut butter, and crackers. The table by the window caught his attention next. On it was a folder labeled "Next Step ES" in bold letters. Inside the folder, James found several papers neatly organized with colored tabs. The first section contained information about veteran services, the address for the local VA office, phone numbers for health services, and forms already partially filled out with his name. The second section had listings for job placement programs that worked specifically with veterans. One page was marked with a yellow sticky note that read, "These people helped my brother. They don't give up easy." The third section had information about a support group for homeless veterans transitioning back to housing. The group met twice a week at a community center just a few blocks away. But it was the last item in the folder that really caught James's attention. It was a business card for Green Valley Landscaping, with a note written on the back: "Ask for Mike. He hires vets. Interview Tuesday at 9 a.m. Clean clothes in the closet." James checked the phone Sarah had given him. It was Monday evening. The interview would be tomorrow morning. "This is happening too fast," James said to himself, feeling panic rise in his chest. He wasn't ready for a job interview. He hadn't worked in years. What would he say? How would he explain where he'd been? As the panic threatened to overwhelm him, James noticed one more thing in the folder: a small note in Sarah's handwriting. "One step at a time, James. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. Just rest. Tomorrow is a new day." James placed the folder back on the table. He made himself a simple sandwich, something he hadn't been able to do for himself in years. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the soft mattress beneath him. For the first time in a very long time, James Wilson fell asleep indoors, clean, with a full stomach, and without fear of what might happen while he slept. The alarm on the phone woke James at 7:00 a.m. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The soft bed, the walls around him, the ceiling above. None of it made sense. Then it all came flooding back. Sarah. The bag. The key. This apartment. James sat up and took a deep breath. Today was the job interview at Green Valley Landscaping. The thought made his stomach turn. He hadn't had a real job interview in years. Before becoming homeless, he had worked as a mechanic, but that felt like another lifetime. After a quick shower, James put on the nicest clothes from the closet, dark jeans and a blue button-up shirt. He tried to make his hair look neat, but it had been cut unevenly the last time he'd taken scissors to it himself. His beard looked better after he trimmed it with a razor he found in the bathroom. "You can do this," he told his reflection, but his eyes showed doubt. James made toast and eggs for breakfast, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. The simple act of cooking food in a kitchen felt strange and wonderful at the same time. He checked the address for Green Valley Landscaping on the card. It was about a 30-minute walk from the apartment. As he left the building, James noticed how differently people looked at him. No one crossed the street to avoid him. No one clutched their bags tighter. In clean clothes with a recently washed face, he was just another person on the sidewalk. Invisible in a completely different way. James arrived at Green Valley Landscaping 20 minutes early. It was a small building with a large yard behind it full of trucks, equipment, and plants. His heart pounded as he approached the front door. Inside, a woman at the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mike," James said, his voice cracking slightly. "About a job. I'm James Wilson." "Have a seat," she said with a smile. "I'll let him know you're here." James sat in a plastic chair by the door, fighting the urge to run. Through a window, he could see men loading trucks with tools and plants. Normal men with normal jobs. Could he really be one of them again? 5 minutes later, a large man with a gray beard and a Green Valley hat walked out. "James, I'm Mike Peterson." James stood and shook his hand, trying to stop his own from trembling. "Come on back to my office," Mike said. "Nothing fancy, just a desk and some chairs." Mike's office was small and cluttered with papers, plant catalogs, and coffee mugs. Photos of landscaping projects covered one wall. A framed Marine Corps flag hung on another. "You served?" James asked, pointing to the flag. Mike nodded. "Iraq, 2003 to 2005. You?" "Afghanistan. 2 tours." A look of understanding passed between them. Mike didn't need to ask why James needed a job or where he'd been. Something in his eyes told James that Mike knew what it was like to struggle after coming home. The interview started simply enough. Mike asked about James' experience with outdoor work, if he could lift heavy things, if he knew how to use basic tools. But when Mike asked about his last job, James felt his chest tighten. "It's been a while," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "I've had trouble since coming back." Sweat broke out on James's forehead. The room seemed to shrink around him. Suddenly, he was back in Afghanistan, hearing the explosion that killed 2 of his friends. His breathing got faster. "I should go," James said, standing up suddenly. This was a mistake. Mike didn't look surprised or angry. He just reached into his desk and pulled out a bottle of water, sliding it across to James. "Take a minute," Mike said calmly. "Happens to me too sometimes. Still, after all these years." James sat back down, embarrassed but grateful. He took a long drink of water. "Look," Mike said, "I don't need to know everything. Sarah called me, said you needed a chance. That's good enough for me." "You know Sarah?" James asked, surprised. "Her brother Michael worked for me for a while after he came back from Iraq," Mike explained. "Good kid. Had his demons like we all do. Sarah's been helping vets ever since." Mike leaned forward. "The job's not complicated. You'll be on Rodriguez's crew, helping with basic landscaping. It's hard work, outdoors, good exercise. Pays $15 an hour to start, 3 days a week for now. If that goes well, we can talk about more." James felt tears in his eyes and blinked them back. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be here Thursday at 7 a.m., Mike replied with a small smile. "And James, it won't be easy. Some days will be harder than others. But you're not alone here." For the first time in years, James felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. 3 months passed quickly. June turned into September, and the hot summer days began to cool. James's life had changed in ways he could hardly believe. The apartment was still his. After the first month that Sarah had paid for, James used his earnings from Green Valley Landscaping to pay the rent himself. It wasn't easy. The money was tight, and sometimes he had to choose between buying new work boots or having meat with his dinner. But the rent was always paid on time. James worked hard at his job. The first few weeks had been tough on his body. Years of poor nutrition and sleeping on hard ground had weakened him. His hands blistered from using shovels and rakes. His back ached each night. But Mike was patient, and the other workers, many of them veterans too, showed him tricks to make the work easier. "You're getting stronger," Rodriguez, his crew leader, told him one day as they loaded bags of mulch into a truck. "When you started, you could barely lift one of these. Now look at you." It was true. James's arms had filled out. His face had more color. The hollow look in his eyes was fading. But the biggest changes weren't physical. James had started going to the VA hospital for regular checkups. After years of avoiding doctors, he finally had a name for the nightmares and panic attacks that had ruined his life after the war: post-traumatic stress disorder. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't weak. His brain had been injured by what he had seen and done in Afghanistan, just as surely as if he had been hit by a bullet. "It's like any other war wound," his therapist explained. "It needs treatment to heal." The treatment wasn't easy. James had to talk about things he had tried to forget. Some sessions left him shaking and unable to sleep. But slowly, the nightmares came less often. The sudden panic attacks when he heard a car backfire or a door slam became less intense. James kept the leather messenger bag that Sarah had given him. It sat on his small desk by the window, no longer holding a key and money, but now filled with his own important papers: his VA card, bus schedules, medication information, and the phone numbers of people he could call when the dark thoughts came back. He had called Sarah a few weeks after starting his job. Their conversation had been awkward at first, but soon felt natural. She visited him at the apartment once a month, bringing cookies or books she thought he might like. James learned more about her brother Michael, who had struggled with PTSD for years after returning from Iraq before taking his own life 2 years ago. "After Michael died, I promised myself I would help other veterans," Sarah told him, "not just with money, but by showing them they're not forgotten." On Sarah's suggestion, James had started volunteering one evening a week at the local veterans shelter. He served food in the kitchen to men and women who looked just like he had: tired, hopeless, invisible. Some of them looked at him with suspicion, others with envy, a few with hope. "I was sitting right where you are last winter," he told one young veteran who couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he ate. "There's a way back." Sometimes the man believed him. Sometimes he didn't. James understood both reactions. The apartment still felt strange sometimes, too good to be true. Some nights, James would wake up in a panic, sure that it had all been a dream and he was back under the highway. He would get up and walk through the rooms, touching the walls, opening the refrigerator, turning on the shower, reminding himself that this was real. On his desk, next to the messenger bag, James kept a small notebook. Each night before bed, he wrote down one good thing that had happened that day. Some days it was big: had first full weekend of work. Called my sister after 4 years. Other days it was small. Saw a hummingbird outside my window. Made perfect scrambled eggs. Each entry ended the same way: still here, still trying. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't even an easy one. But it was his, and day by day, James Wilson was building it back, one small piece at a time. 1 year had passed since that rainy day when Sarah had given James the messenger bag. The calendar on his wall showed October 15th, circled in red. Today was an important day. He was going to speak at a community center fundraiser for homeless veterans. James stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. He hardly recognized himself anymore. His hair was neatly cut, his beard trimmed short. The deep lines on his face were still there, but they looked more like marks of experience than signs of suffering. His eyes, once dull and distant, now looked clear and focused. "You can do this," he told his reflection, the same words he had said a year ago before his job interview. But this time he believed them. The community center was only a few blocks from his apartment. James walked there, enjoying the cool fall air. Leaves crunched under his new shoes. He wore his best clothes: dress pants, a blue shirt, and the tie that Mike had given him for his 6-month work anniversary. Across his chest hung the leather messenger bag. It was more worn now, with a small tear on one corner, but James wouldn't trade it for anything. Inside were his notes for today's speech and something very special he had been saving for months. The community center was filled with people when James arrived. Some were well-dressed donors who had come to support the homeless veterans program. Others were social workers, counselors, and program directors. In the back rows sat men and women who looked like James had a year ago, tired, wary, hoping for help but afraid to believe in it. Sarah waited for him near the door. She wore a yellow dress that reminded James of her umbrella from that first day. Nervous? She asked with a smile. Terrified, James admitted, but ready. The program director introduced James to the crowd. Our next speaker has an amazing story to share. Just 1 year ago, he was living under a highway bridge. Today, he works full-time, volunteers with our program, and is taking classes to become a counselor for other veterans. Please welcome James Wilson. The crowd clapped as James walked to the small stage. He took a deep breath and looked out at the faces watching him. My name is James Wilson, he began. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. When I came home, I brought the war with me inside my head. I lost my job, my home, and almost my life. James told his story simply, not hiding the hard parts, the years on the street, the hunger, the hopelessness. He talked about the day Sarah stopped to talk to him and gave him the messenger bag with the key inside. That bag didn't just hold a key to an apartment, he said. It held a key to a future I couldn't see anymore. It showed me that someone still believed I was worth saving, even when I didn't believe it myself. As he spoke, James noticed a woman in the back row. She sat alone, her clothes clean but very worn. Her eyes never left his face as he talked. There was something in those eyes that James recognized immediately, the same look he had seen in his own reflection for years. The look of someone who had given up. After his speech, while people gathered for refreshments, James made his way to the back of the room. The woman was still sitting there, staring at her hands. Hi, James said, sitting down beside her. I'm James. Lisa, she answered quietly. That was a good speech, but not everyone gets that lucky. James nodded. You're right. It's not about luck, though. It's about one person caring enough to make a difference. And then that person caring enough to do the same for someone else. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a smaller bag, similar to the one Sarah had given him. Inside was an envelope with some cash he had saved over many months, information about resources for homeless women, and a key to a small room he had arranged with the help of the Veterans Program. This helped me once, James said, holding out the bag to her. Maybe it can help you too. Lisa looked at the bag, then at James, confusion and suspicion on her face. Why would you do this for a stranger? James smiled, thinking of Sarah, thinking of all the small kindnesses that had built his new life over the past year. Because we're not strangers, he said. We're just people who haven't helped each other yet. As Lisa slowly took the bag, James noticed Sarah watching from across the room. She gave him a small nod, her eyes shining with tears. The circle was complete.